Well, I'm quite curious about this last sentence, that I refuse to academize. Did I say that? Well, I will show.
I know you do.
Yeah, okay. Well, well, I was fascinated by the story about the infrastructure, because my story is also about infrastructure, but a whole other one, and I think that's important for further discussion. I have no images, so you can look at my name for a long time. Well, it's a pleasure to have this afternoon the opportunity to muse a little while on the subject of artistic research. As you've seen in the program, a differentiation has been made between different kinds of research. And although I was and still am involved in the programming of this day, I yet want to stress that in my view all these research approaches necessarily have to go back to one fundamental they share: the relation between art and research. In its very wording, artistic research then comes closest to art research. Art is still named and lingers in the word artistic. In its first use, I think, it has been called artistic because it came to be opposed to scientific research. Science research would also sound quite strange, just as art research seems to be an odd combination as well. What we, however, should view as decisive is that two terms are dominant behind this combination of terms, and that is art and science. Although art is a so-called catch-all concept, the word science is even worse. Instead of catching all, it mostly shows a narrow-minded view. Science is mainly associated with the natural sciences, especially when connected to art. As I've shown at another occasion, it's better to talk about scholarship instead of science, because scholarship comprehends both the natural sciences, the humanities, and other knowledge or research fields that do not feel at home with the word science. The Dutch word wetenschap is therefore much broader. It refers to knowing and the way to grasp knowledge. It would have been better that wetenschap, just as the word landschap, which the English introduced in their language as the word landscape, would also have received currency in the world. And this also accounts for the German equivalent Wissenschaft and Landschaft. An English scholar recently indicated that the suffix schap in wetenschap and landschap refers to the Dutch Frisian word schop, which again refers to scooping earth against the water. So it means making land. It's an action to throw something. This means, therefore, that something is made and not only found. This also applies to the English word research, which literally means to find back. This implies that what is found was already there to be found. The concept of onderzoek or Untersuchung is, however, much more directed towards an activity. To find things down under somewhere that were probably not there beforehand. The English equivalent enquire therefore reflects this more active character. So if we talk internationally about artistic research, the word research, just like the word science, are to be taken not too literally. Both words are in fact badly chosen. Well, is this a problem? Not at all. If we agree that we want to express that both research and the artistic are malleable terms, terms that ask again and again to be reinterpreted. That is to say, that they are treated as open source terms. And that's also the way I should like to treat them in the following text. I've recently published a text for a magazine that is meant for managers, boards, and other colleges in higher education in the Netherlands. It's called in Dutch, Tussen academies and academies. Well, here you've got a problem with the English translation. It's between academics and the academies. Both terms sound the same in Dutch, but they differ considerably, although they have also a connection. And this relationship is at stake today. How do academics, or academia, as it is called, and the art academies relate? And when did they become connected? Let's follow a few lines that I proposed in that article. One of the things that I wanted to make clear is that art schools have a long history of more than 400 years. and that this is a serious indication that we should not fool around with them. The main subject of these schools, the arts, were, in history, always juxtaposed to the sciences. They were not confused, although their final separation only took place by the end of the 18th century. Then the so-called Beaux-Arts were formulated, which included also music, architecture, and rhetorics. All the arts came to be seen as one big family, and I think ArtEZ can also find here its legitimation. When this familization, so to speak, was finished, then something very important occurred, the arrival of the singular concept of art. Before that, art as a concept was not seen as the driving force behind the arts. The aesthetic domain was only possible when art received its own power. And this also accounts for science. Both science and art became, in the 19th century, the metaphysical concepts to which all the sciences, including humanities and so forth, and all the different arts could refer to. So there was one art to refer to as a last ground for the arts, and there was one science to refer to as a last ground for the sciences. In this move, art and science were seen as equivalents. That is to say that science was not depending on art, whereas art was not depending on science. They were two important realms of human existence. They could, however, be connected in several ways or work together, as history abundantly has shown. Well, this line of reasoning becomes very important when we want to situate art education now within the field of research. In the Netherlands, as we all know, art education has been put into the hands of the so-called vocational higher education, which is known as the HBO. Art academies, conservatories, theatre schools, etc. were not moved to the universities, but were connected to the vocational education programs. I do not know what motives were used to put them there, but it's easy to see that the practical part of the arts, that is, that in many cases they make things, was one of them. Although making in the art is of course basic, the meaning of making itself is quite another matter. And not at all obvious. Why? Because the very act of making is something which has been inquired by many modern artists. Making is not just a practical matter, that is a matter of simply doing something, but is far more reaching. Making, with regard to art, is fundamentally connected to what we can call reflection, theory, or to theorizing. This means that every act is also a reflecting, which happens to be also the name of our conference today. It's not my term, but it popped up. Making is an act, but it's also a reaction, a reaction. I will come back to this vital and vitalist argument perhaps some later. What does this have to do with the position of art education? In the first place, it means that thinking, theorizing, reflecting, etc. are part and parcel of the different practices of art. Art is not simply there as a given or an assignment, but is there as something to be looked for, to be invented every time and again, and therefore to be looked after. Art is always a mixture, a melange of different elements, and is not there yet. Art educational institutes should therefore provide apt instruments, perhaps an infrastructure, I'm not sure, to let the future makers get the grips on this both material and immaterial property. In art, theory and practice are interwoven. They can be discerned, but they cannot be separated. This is, as far as I've observed, much less the case in other HBO institutes. Apart from the fact that most HBO programs are rather young and cannot legitimate themselves by a long history, the most important difference between them and the arts is that the HBOs do research by applying knowledge that was not developed in the first place by themselves. After the introduction of research in the HBO institutes call themselves consequently Universities of Applied Sciences. And that seems to be quite clear for them. HBO starts with using knowledge that was developed within the universities, which are here abbreviated to sciences. They are acting as living valorization makers. What we see here is that theory and practices do not necessarily belong to each other yet. They first exist in separated worlds. My thesis is that this is, or at least should not be, the case in art education. Theory, research, and practice are a holy threesome when talking about art. Questions or problematics that are necessary to call something artistic research should rise from this combination. I can imagine that I work a bit too fast now, but let's therefore have a short look at the role of theory, make it a bit more complex. Theory should not be seen as a fixed system, as something static and ideal. Instead, we should view it as a force and an activity that is analog to the working processes of art and to creative processes as such. It's not a static system, but a becoming. Especially the performing arts have developed an explicit attention to the doing of theory, that is, to the realizing of discursive artistic practices. And this kind of performative reasoning can be connected to an idea that was central, to my surprise, to pre-classical thinkers, the idea of theory as an activity. As I've shown elsewhere, theory, or theoria, was an inquiring activity before it became fixed into systems. Especially the figure of the so-called theoros, who wandered around in the 5th century before Christ to meet other theoroi and discuss on a supranational ground all the happenings in the world, is appealing to today's use of theory and theorizing. The theoros showed an active form of acquiring or making knowledge, which was directly connected to practical daily life. Theory can here be seen as a practice. And it's precisely this that differentiates art education or art from other HBO fields. So if we are looking for how to develop research within art education, we should not look in the first place to the HBO. If we would do this slavishly, it would lead to a denial of art's essence. That is, being, or rather, becoming art. Art is not a given. And questions arise from within the doing. It's therefore necessary to go back a little bit in the history, because art, as we know today, only originated some 200 years ago. So not in the very old caves or in the Renaissance. All those so-called works of art that are connected to them have only become art in retrospective. As I suggested earlier, it was necessary that the arts were to become a family before they finally could open up the new realm of art. As we all know, this development coincided with the invention of, for instance, aesthetics as an academic discipline in the 18th century, followed by the development of art history, the development of the idea that art has its own history that moves it forward was a new idea. But also the building of new rooms and spaces for art. Think of the museum and a new way of talking about art, think of art criticism. So art was not only some immaterial metaphysical phenomenon, on the contrary, art became visible and debatable as it had never been before. What is more, art was also the outcome of the so-called free market that developed in the period and which was based on interest, or l'intérêt, as Foucault would call it. Art was henceforth produced for an anonymous market that developed along with the new developing civil society. Artists were therefore never sure of success or economic success, but they could contribute to art as such, which could serve as a kind of consolation. So it was a new civil society where art found its refuge in the first place, and it was civil society that asked from art to comment on its behavior. So art was something inside and outside society at the same time. The idea to view art as a free reflecting phenomenon, a self-reflecting thing, a self-made thing, was a complex development. Curiously enough, it developed at the same time that research in the arts, or artistic research, was done for the first time in history. This seems to be a forgotten line in the history of arts. And this is not strange, or unexplainable, for it is connected perhaps to the historical and somewhat difficult relationship between art history and aesthetics. For it was aesthetics, which means sensual perception, that emancipated the arts to become seriously taken because it was connected to sensual knowledge. And this kind of knowledge first had a bad reputation within rationalistic philosophy, but gained a higher appreciation by the introduction of aesthetics. Art was emancipated by this act. And it was the Dutch philosopher and draftsman Frans Hemsterhuis, who nobody knows, but I know him. It was the Dutch philosopher and draftsman Frans Hemsterhuis who can be seen as the first artist who, by his writings and drawings in the latter half of the 18th century, tried to connect practice and theory in such a way that one transforms the other and vice versa. Art, theory, and practice were connected in an intricate way. This philosopher was the subject of my doctoral dissertation that I wrote in the 90s, because he tried to combine practice and theory in a very special, not to say an idiosyncratic way. Before I ever had heard about artistic research, but I was very interested at that moment in the connection of theory and practice. In my introduction to that book, I wrote that for the first time in history, a visual experiment is being described which is exclusively dedicated to the aesthetical, that is subjective experience of beauty. In this experiment, works of art were made the exclusive carriers of the experience of beauty. Hemsterhuis's aesthetic was based on drawings that he purposely made by way of experiment to prove the mechanisms of beauty and of the sublime. Both his text and his drawings were combined in one book, The Letter on Sculpture from 1769, which can be seen as a work of art in itself. It is beautifully designed and carefully printed and bound. It was not offered for sale because it would do its proper work when given to people he wanted to relate to, friends and interested scholars and artists. Although he was not rich, he invested much in the visual appearance of his ideas. As already suggested, his approach has much in common with current ideas on and practices of artistic research. Hemsterhuis can indeed be seen as the first philosopher/artist who proved his aesthetic theory by means of self-made drawings that served both as proof and as outcome of a theory. His drawings were not an illustration of a theory, but they became theory themselves. That is to say, they were the basis of a perceptual experiment from which he deduced his ideas on art and beauty. In one word, practice becomes theory, vice versa. The principle he developed could only be proven in a work of art itself, not by reason alone. It is therefore important to observe that his drawings were not geometrical figures, but figurative ones. He insisted that his drawings were works of art in their own right. And this is vital because his bold assumption was that only through works of art we can experience beauty. Nature was not capable of producing beauty at all by itself. The definition of the beautiful that Hemsterhuis finally concocted from his visual art-based experiment was that beauty is that which gives us, in the shortest possible time, as many ideas as possible. Or, as the Russian writer Tolstoy had put it, among the Dutch, Hemsterhuis, who influenced the German aestheticians and Goethe, is noteworthy. According to his teaching, beauty is that which gives us the greatest pleasure, and that which gives us the greatest pleasure is that which gives us the greatest number of ideas within the shortest time. The pleasure of the beautiful is the highest knowledge to which man can attain because it gives the greatest number of perceptions in the shortest time. End of quote. What we see here happening is that Hemsterhuis, who was a good draftsman, is in a certain way a proto-artistic researcher. Because what is at stake here is that he developed a theory within practice that became one of the cornerstones of modern art. That is our modern conception of art. We could state that research in the arts was actually invented then, because only in connection with our modern idea of art, this could be realized and thought of. It's the combination of the modern notion of art and the connection of practice and theory that is necessary to let artistic research come to the fore. One of its main characteristics is the idea of transformation. We heard it already. Nishan talked about that. Practice and theory are touched by each other. And what about artistic research now? We have seen that the possibility for research in the arts was invented at the moment that we invented art around 1800. Research has become obligatory in higher education since the Bologna Treaty in 1999. We've seen that art schools should take their own place, their third position between universities and HBO. Art schools have a long history and started as theory institutes, not as places where art was made, for a very long time. This only would develop during the 19th century. Only then art practice and theory came together. Till the 60s of the 20th century, art schools were very conservative and stuck to so-called eternal ideas with regard to art. Art itself, however, outside of the academies, developed in a myriad of ways and can be characterized by its structural, idiosyncratic attention and development. That is to say that the personal was paramount, whereas in art schools, till the 60s, the personal was almost absent. This changed radically when artists who were important in the art world itself, and thus served change instead of academic truth, finally could enter the academies from which they were excluded for a very long time. So it was only then that the big changes that were prepared around 1800 in art itself could enter the schools of art. And this went along with the introduction in the schools of art to search for one's own artistic identity. And this searching capacity, next to the development of conceptual art, could now serve as the perfect ground for introducing research within the curricula of schools of art. It goes without saying that research within the schools of art should follow the one characteristic that makes art art, which is the idiosyncratic attitude. Art education should not imitate the HBO nor the university, but should find out, or better, inquire how research can be developed within its own terms. Not by isolating itself from the others, but by confronting itself with the others. This is something art always did when it started its course around 1800. Art has never been an isolated societal phenomenon, for it can only exist and act in relation to others, while at the same time not giving up its main identity. Just like art schools should move between different knowledge and experience fields and go their own third way. It's appropriate that art research does not simply assume the various guises of scholarships, but seeks its own way in the deliberate combining of knowledge domains. Art can thereby detect particular forms of knowledge which are far from difficult to research in scholarship. Here, art is not researching what scholarship ignores, which would be an argument for research ex negativo, or what scholarship has provided, which would be an argument for viewing art exclusively as an applied research. Instead, research in and through art represents the dimension of knowledge that scholarship has no access to, and where art had not yet been active. Due to the performative character of its actions and statements, artistic research in and through the arts constitutes a highly individual form of research. It actualizes what it wants to show. It reveals, heeds, and makes its knowledge tangible. Thank you.